Between 1940 and 1945, over 1.1 million people, primarily Jews, were murdered in a variety of Auschwitz blocks, each representing a different facet of the camp's barbarity. Block 10 in Auschwitz stood as a hellish laboratory. It was here that the darkest elements of Nazi pseudoscience played out, medical experiments that stripped away dignity, autonomy, and humanity of the prisoners who were selected, often at random, based on their vulnerability, and then subjected to experiments that had no scientific merit, and were in fact cruel and sadistic in nature. Dr. Karl Klauberg was one of the primary perpetrators in Block 10. A German gynecologist, Klauberg conducted experiments to develop methods of mass sterilization for the Nazi regime's goal of racial purification. His experiments focused on the fallopian tubes of female prisoners, with substances like formalin, phenyl, and nitric acid injected directly into their bodies. Without anesthesia, these women endured excruciating pain, often resulting in permanent injury, infertility, and death. Klauberg's experiments were carried out with a disturbing sense of pride. In letters to his superiors, he boasted about his success, claiming to have perfected a technique that would sterilize large populations of women in a quick, efficient manner. Alongside Klauberg, Dr. Horst Schumann conducted equally inhumane experiments on prisoners. Schumann, a German physician, was notorious for his radiation experiments, which were often directed at Roma prisoners, particularly women and children. The goal of his research was to test the effects of radiation on the human body, leading to agonizing, often fatal consequences. Schumann also carried out castration experiments, designed to scientifically evaluate the impact of sterilization on prisoners, focusing on male prisoners, particularly those who were considered racially inferior. His experiments caused severe mutilation, often leading to infections, permanent injuries, and excruciating pain that prisoners were left to suffer without medical care. Perhaps the most infamous figure associated with Block 10 was Dr. Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death. Mengele's experiments, particularly those performed on twins, were designed to fulfill his sick obsession with genetics and eugenics. Mengele believed that studying twins would unlock the secrets to perfecting the Aryan race, so he subjected them to horrific trials. He injected dyes into their eyes in an attempt to change their eye color, sewed twins together in grotesque, life-threatening surgeries, and performed lethal injections of chloroform in an attempt to test the effects of poisons. One of the survivors of these harrowing experiments, Stanislawa Leszczynska, dedicated herself to caring for the women and infants, helping to deliver babies in secret, and risking her life to provide medical care under extreme conditions. Other survivors such as Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier and Vera Alexander spoke out in later years, recounting the unthinkable suffering they endured and the unspeakable crimes committed in Block 10. Block 11, known as the Death Block, was one of the most dreaded and terrifying locations within Auschwitz. The block earned its infamous name due to the unrelenting torture and executions that occurred within its walls. It housed a variety of prisoners, political dissidents, resistance fighters, those deemed undesirable by the Nazis, and anyone else who dared defy the regime. The conditions in Block 11 were designed to be a living nightmare, a place where survival was almost impossible. One of the most notorious forms of punishment in Block 11 was the use of standing cells. These tiny, suffocating spaces were barely large enough for a prisoner to stand. Prisoners who were placed in these cells were often forced to remain standing for days on end, crammed inside with no room to sit or lie down. The conditions were unbearable: overcrowding, stifling heat in the summer, and freezing cold in the winter. The lack of space made it impossible to breathe properly, and the extreme discomfort often led to the victim collapsing from exhaustion. Standing for prolonged periods of time, prisoners would eventually succumb to asphyxiation or exhaustion. Another horrific punishment was the use of starvation cells, a place where death was delivered not by the violence of a gun, but by the slow, agonizing process of starvation and dehydration. These cells were designed for those prisoners the Nazi deemed to be unworthy of even the brief respite of death. Starved of food and water, prisoners were left to waste away. The prolonged suffering of these victims could last for weeks, with their bodies deteriorating from malnutrition and dehydration and eventually leading to their deaths. Just outside Block 11 lay the infamous execution yard, known as the Death Wall. It was here that thousands of prisoners were shot by the SS. The wall became a symbol of Nazi brutality, a place where individuals, many of them political prisoners, resistance members, and even those who had simply spoken out against the regime, were executed without trial. Among the countless victims who met their end at the death wall was Father Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish priest who became a symbol of selflessness and sacrifice. Kolbe, upon hearing that a fellow prisoner would be executed in retaliation for an escape attempt, volunteered to take the man's place, offering his life to save another. He was led to the death wall along with 9 other men. Father Kolbe's martyrdom was one of the most profound acts of sacrifice that emerged from the horrors of Auschwitz. Even in the face of such overwhelming cruelty, resistance movements began to emerge among the prisoners, and some managed to fight back. One of the most significant revolts was the Sonderkommando uprising in October 1944. The Sonderkommando were prisoners forced to work in the crematoriums, disposing of the bodies of those killed in the gas chambers. The prisoners, who had been subjected to unimaginable trauma, managed to rise up against their Nazi captors. In an act of defiance, they destroyed Crematorium 4, setting it on fire and attempting to escape. The uprising, however, was met with brutal reprisals. The SS quickly retaliated by executing those who were involved in the revolt, and many were tortured before being killed. Despite the brutal crackdown, the uprising became a symbol of resistance. The SS officers who worked at Auschwitz, particularly those assigned to Block 11, were notorious for their sadistic cruelty. Figures like Gerhard Paulich, an SS officer infamous for his brutality, became symbols of the Nazi regime's inhumanity. Paulich was known for his extreme cruelty, regularly tormenting prisoners and taking pleasure in their suffering. Many survivors, such as Stanislav Glova and Josef Krech, bore witness to the unrelenting violence of Block 11 and spoke of the terrible conditions they endured. Glova and others like him made it their mission to share the stories of the brutality they had endured. Through their testimony, the true scale of the horrors of Auschwitz, particularly Block 11, became known. Block 24, established in 1943 as a brothel, was a place where women were brutally exploited for the sadistic pleasure of SS officers and privileged male prisoners who had completed hard labor. What the Nazis presented as a reward for certain prisoners was, in reality, a nightmarish form of sexual slavery, which served both as a tool for the officers' indulgence and a means of further dehumanizing their victims. The women who were coerced into this horrific arrangement were primarily Polish political prisoners, often selected based on their vulnerability and their perceived usefulness. The SS made promises of better treatment, including improved living conditions and relief from the brutality of forced labor. However, these promises were cruel lies designed to deceive and manipulate the women into compliance. Once inside Block 24, the women were forced into a world of constant sexual abuse, humiliation, and violence. They were not given any agency over their lives and were forced to endure repeated assaults. The atmosphere inside the brothel was one of constant fear and suffering. The women had no choice but to comply with the demands of their tormentors, and their suffering was exasperated by the ever-present threat of violence from both the SS and the male prisoners. Many were given little to no protection from disease or physical injury, as the conditions in the brothel were both unsanitary and brutal. Among the most notorious figures associated with Block 24 was Irma Greza, one of the most infamous female SS guards at Auschwitz. Greza, often referred to as the Beautiful Beast, was known for her extreme cruelty and sadism. She was one of the guards who would inflict brutal punishments on the women forced into sexual slavery within the brothel. Greza's reputation for violence and brutality was well known among the prisoners, and her involvement in the abuse of the women in Block 24 only added to the horrors of her existence. Helena Bobowska, one of the survivors, offered a first-hand account of the dehumanizing abuse she and others endured. In her testimony, she described the fear, the physical violence, and the psychological torment that came with being forced into the brothel. Block 4 at Auschwitz, once a Polish army barracks, was transformed into a poignant and deeply emotional memorial to those who perished in the camp. Unlike other parts of Auschwitz, which were sites of brutal torture and unimaginable suffering, Block 4 stands as a somber reminder of the lives lost, the families destroyed, and the relentless cruelty of the Nazi regime. Inside it houses some of the most powerful and personal exhibits that convey the human cost of the Holocaust, offering a glimpse into the lives of the victims before their tragic end. One of the most striking and emotional exhibits inside Block 4 is the display of over 110,000 shoes, carefully arranged in glass cases. Each pair symbolizes a person. Each shoe represents an individual who had their life taken away at Auschwitz. Among these shoes, some are children's sandals, while others are worn-out work boots or elegant high heels. The inclusion of children's shoes is particularly heartbreaking as it emphasizes the tragic loss of innocence and the systematic targeting of families. In addition to the shoes, another haunting exhibit in Block 4 features labeled suitcases left behind by the victims of Auschwitz. These suitcases are marked with names, birth dates, and transport numbers, offering an intensely personal connection to the victims. Another deeply moving exhibit inside Block 4 is a collection of 40,000 pairs of glasses neatly arranged in tangled piles. Among the most poignant and emotionally charged items on display is the prosthetic leg of a Polish political prisoner named Józef Sogner. Sogner, a man who already suffered the loss of his leg, was sent to Auschwitz where he faced further unimaginable horrors. Block 7 at Auschwitz was known for its horrifying overcrowding, deplorable conditions, and the rampant spread of disease. Initially designed to house only 200 prisoners, it was frequently crammed with over 1,000 individuals, subjected to inhumane conditions that led to widespread suffering and death. With the barracks overflowing, hygiene and sanitation were nearly non-existent. The spread of diseases like typhus and dysentery were inevitable, and these diseases became deadly epidemics within the block. Without proper medical care or even basic necessities, the prisoners' immune systems were decimated by harsh conditions, leaving them vulnerable to infection and death. Typhus, in particular, spread rapidly due to the close quarters and lack of cleanliness. The disease carried by lice caused fevers, exhaustion, and delirium, and was often fatal. Dysentery, caused by contaminated food and water, led to severe hydration, causing many prisoners to waste away before their deaths. The lack of food and proper nutrition made it impossible for the weakened prisoners to fight off these illnesses. Those who did survive these diseases were often left in a constant state of weakness and despair. In addition to disease, the prisoners were subjected to brutal forced labor. They were made to work long hours, performing grueling tasks with little rest or food. The work conditions were harsh, and any attempt to resist or slow down was met with violence. Among the prisoners in Block 7 was Mala Zimetbaum, a Belgian Jewish resistance fighter, who became one of the most inspiring figures in Auschwitz. Despite the horrific conditions surrounding her, Mala risked her life to help other prisoners. She shared food with starving children, often smuggling bread and other sustenance into the block. Mala's courage and selflessness did not stop at sharing food. In a remarkable act of resistance, she and her lover, Edward Galinski, attempted a daring escape from the camp. This bold escape plan became a symbol of hope for the other prisoners. Despite the immense risk, Mala believed that even the smallest act of defiance could break the Nazis' stranglehold over them. Unfortunately, she was caught before she could escape, and her fate was sealed. She was brutally executed by the Nazis. Tova Friedman was just 6 years old when she was brought to Auschwitz, making her the youngest known survivor of the camp. Her story is both heartbreaking and miraculous. Tova's memories of her time in Auschwitz are marked by the trauma and horror that every child of her age was subjected to. The trauma she endured would stay with her for the rest of her life, but her survival serves as a powerful reminder of the strength of the human spirit, even in the most horrific circumstances. In addition to the widespread suffering caused by disease, starvation, and forced labor, Block 7 was also the site where Dr. Josef Mengele continued his gruesome experiments on prisoners, particularly children. Block 21 at Auschwitz, ironically labeled the infirmary, was far from a place of healing or hope. Instead, it became a symbol of the horrific neglect, medical abuse, and suffering that defined the camp's brutal regime. While it may have been officially designated as a medical facility, the reality was much darker. Prisoners sent to Block 21 were often those who had been deemed unfit for forced labor, either due to illness, injury, or exhaustion. In theory, they were to receive care. In practice, they were abandoned to suffer and die. The conditions in Block 21 were squalid and unbearable. The rooms were infested with lice, and the prisoners lay on straw mattresses that offered no relief from the filth and discomfort. The stench of decay and bodily waste hung heavy in the air. There was no real medical treatment. The so-called care given by the SS was a farce, aimed at furthering the Nazi agenda of experimenting on the victims, rather than healing them. The infirmary was overcrowded with the weak, the sick, and the elderly. Yet even as the prisoners suffered from these ailments, there was no effort to alleviate their pain. Instead, they were left to die in the most inhumane conditions imaginable. The so-called medical treatment in Block 21 was often nothing more than a guise for experimentation. Nazi doctors conducted brutal experiments under the pretense of scientific research, but the true goal was to inflict suffering, gather data on human reactions to torture, and advance the Nazi ideology of racial purity. While the majority of the medical staff in Auschwitz were complicit in these atrocities, a few doctors took risks to help the prisoners. One of the most notable was Dr. Gisela Perl, a Hungarian Jewish gynecologist who worked secretly to provide care to the women in the infirmary. Though she was under constant threat of being killed for any act of kindness or disobedience, Dr. Perl risked her life to help the women who were subjected to barbaric treatments. She performed clandestine abortions on women who had been subjected to brutal sterilization experiments or impregnated by the SS, often saving their lives in the process. She would go to great lengths to help, even as she too faced the horrors of the camp. In her memoir, Dr. Perl speaks of the emotional and psychological toll of her work, the ethical dilemmas she had to navigate, and the harrowing experiences of the women she tried to help. In one of the most poignant moments, Dr. Perl recalls the faces of the women she saved and the ways they tried to thank her despite the unimaginable suffering they endured. Another critical account comes from Dr. Eddie de Vind, a Dutch Jewish doctor who was also forced into the camp. In his memoir, Dr. de Vind describes the conditions in the infirmary and the constant tension between performing his medical duties and dealing with the rampant atrocities occurring around him. As a doctor, he was placed in a unique position of witnessing both the suffering of the prisoners and the inhumanity of the Nazi medical staff. He was often placed in situations where he had to make impossible choices: to save a prisoner at the risk of his own life, or to comply with the SS and their orders to experiment on the prisoners. The experience of living through Auschwitz and witnessing the atrocities that occurred in Block 21 was something that few survivors could adequately express in words. For many, art became a way to process the trauma and offer a testimony to the world. Marian Kołodziej, a Polish Catholic artist who survived Auschwitz, became one of the most powerful voices of this generation of survivors. Kołodziej's art, created after his liberation, offers a haunting visual representation of the suffering, despair, and death he witnessed inside Auschwitz. His drawings, which were based on his own experiences as a stretcher bearer, capture the anguish and hopelessness that marked life in Block 21. The survivors of these death blocks continue to educate future generations about the horrors of Auschwitz and the importance of preventing such cruelty from ever happening again.